Hello and welcome. I am Steve Clemens, editor-at-large of The Hill. Thanks for joining us today for our program, Reset 2021, A New American Start. Our virtual two-part summit today will look at 4 issues likely to take center stage during this new administration: and Congress, the economy, infrastructure, immigration, and the environment. After any election, policy shifts take place on both sides of Pennsylvania Avenue, from the White House down to Capitol Hill. Priorities and goals are inevitably recalibrated. The first part of our program will examine the economy that's been decimated by the pandemic and how it can be revitalized. President Biden's plan to build back better includes an emphasis on America's roads, bridges, airports, and broadband. What will these initiatives entail, and how will inequities in this digital age be tackled? Before we can get answers to those questions, a few housekeeping notes. You can tweet us at The Hill Events using the hashtag #TheHillReset. We're broadcasting live, and I'm going to take your questions throughout this program. As with any live stream, it could go bad. I'm told if you just refresh, it'll fix most of the problems. We begin with Arizona Congressman David Schweikert, the senior Republican on the Joint Economic Committee. I love talking to David Schweikert. We talked to him before the election. I'm pleased to be talking to him after the election. Congressman, thank you so much for joining us today. You know, what we're trying
Stephen, thank you for having me.
Yeah, and always my pleasure. But I want to, get at the point there's a kind of, moment of reset, right? That's a good way to say it. But there's also sort of a scramble to sort of frame and put the scaffolding around what we ought to be talking about. You're on the Joint Economic Committee, and I'm interested in how, particularly members of your caucus and you, look at what needs to be done to buoy the economy. We've had kind of a whiplash when it's come to executive orders. Executive orders President Trump put in place, executive orders President Biden has taken off. What do you need to see happen in the economy to get the right kind of reset?
Well, my answer actually might sound a little ethereal, but it's not. Joint Economic Committee, some of our freaky smart economists have been looking at, there's more going on, and we could use some of those things that are going on to build, you call it the reset. 2 ends of it. One, the number of individuals, entrepreneurs who've been decimated. At the same time, we're seeing a stunning spike across the country of new LLCs, new businesses being started. There's many of those in the entrepreneurial class are trying to start new business concerns. How do we use that as one of the cornerstones, one of the building blocks for bringing this economy back? Do you provide access to capital? Do you provide a cleaner a regulatory, licensing, permitting stream? That is one side. The other side, and this is the more difficult one, is the definition of infrastructure. In your opening, Steve, you actually spoke about things like the digital divide. Well, the reality right now, you could actually leap that chasm. How many of the microsatellites that provide broadband are being launched at this moment? Meaning every part of North America, by functionally the end of this year, has broadband. Do we continue with the same model that we've been doing for 20, 25 years of providing subsidies to run fiber to the middle of nowhere, instead of saying, let's actually put a micro satellite dish and use that for the community's broadband? So there's going to be also a battle of the definition of infrastructure. If it's true in the next few years that much of our transportation fleet will be electrified, could we also use that as part of bringing smart transportation, where everything from your stoplights to your data back and forth in your GPS and those things maximizes efficiency in our urban, suburban, and even rural communities? And that becomes a fight, because a lot of the lobbying population still see the world of infrastructure as pouring concrete. And for many of us, we want to sort of say, what is the ultimate definition that's actually good for our communities? What actually creates the most economic growth? It's going to be a combination of technology, smart design, and of course, pouring that concrete.
Congressman, you just touched on so many things that are my favorite topics. And one of them, and I'm going to break away from my script here, because one of them, a friend of mine, Ahmad Bhutani, who's the CEO of GoDaddy. GoDaddy is the largest internet registrar in the nation. And what they track are a lot of these
Scottsdale based in my district.
Wow, I didn't know that. So micro businesses and ventures, which fall beneath that category that we often talk about, small business. I mean, small business, excuse everybody, almost sounds Brezhnevian if you're only talking about a 300-person company, right? So, I think the question is, what do you do at that level? I've talked to tons of these small businesses in it, and David, I just think that you're onto something. What do they need? Well, one of the things they need is to be heard, that they're there and they matter. That's one of the things. The other side of it, I talked to just this week a guy who runs, it was in one of the articles written by Aman Bhutani, but about Denison, Texas, and a business incubator that's looking at e-commerce. Because there are a lot of skills and tasks that an entrepreneur may not have. They know how to kind of move the dial on what they're obsessed with, but there are other dimensions. And so I think what you're talking about is really important. And when you look at the nation, those areas with those micro ventures, those LLCs being created, are far more economically resilient than those with less. So I am so pleased you mentioned that.
And one of the political concerns, and this sort of hopefully will split the chasm between the right and the left, is, as you call them, micro ventures, don't have a political lobbying voice. Yet we can see how powerful they are in the underpinning of the economy, and also the really unique efficiencies they bring. Think of your own neighborhood where you live right now. When did your local restaurant, having such difficulties, all of a sudden now go out and invest in a food truck or a satellite kitchen to do delivery services? It's happening all around us. But because it's not on our financial news channel or on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, we may not see it, but we see it in the data. And so as the theme of this is, what's the reset look like? I believe if we could actually pay attention to the millions and millions and millions of, let's call them micro entrepreneurs around our society, how do you give them the cleanest path to be able to get some capital, the cleanest path to get permitted, to engage in their e-commerce business? And it turns out, if we could clean up a whole bunch of other rules and regulations, from the definition of technology and health services, the definition of use of technology and environment, many of these other things, there's actually a unified theory we've been working on that brings it all together, that may be the next economic renaissance for the country.
And Congressman, you also said something you also pushed another button of mine, and I don't want to, get lost in dark politics of the past.
But you said, buttons.
Yeah, no, you said something really important about what should we consider and define as infrastructure. Now, I don't want to get lost in the politics over the wall, but I had Will Hurd, former Congressman Will Hurd, on here when he was still in Congress. And he said, look, this is an opportunity for us to redefine what a wall means. Is it drones? What's electronic? It's not just a slab. There are other, that's the last century. The new century is, all these other dimensions to security. Now, what I just heard you say about roads and smart systems and electricity grids and all of this is that the smartness, the data, the sensors, the feedback is as vital in that infrastructure as whatever, commodity raw materials you're putting in. That, I totally agree with you on that, but I'm wondering, in terms of the Joint Economic Committee and the role you have there, what's the literacy of your colleagues on that to understand that when you talk infrastructure, that kind of embedded dimension needs to be part of it today?
The problem is, and let's be honest, and this is sort of a shot at all of my kind, we're sort of calcified intellectually. How many of the debates do we listen to and we still sound like it's the 1990s? And that was one of the reasons I talked about the broadband microsatellites going up, because it's just a simple visual, yet I promise you 2 weeks from now, there'll be someone on the floor of the House talking about running, another strip of copper or fiber out to a rural community. Well, that rural community needs broadband.
Right.
But that piece of fiber and copper probably isn't the solution anymore. And being here in Arizona, where I have some incredibly remote populations in my tribal communities that have been waiting 20 years, turns out the solution is here. We just now have to update the statutes and the funding mechanisms. But now let's take it to healthcare. One of my fixations is the debate we've been having the last decade is absurd. The ACA functionally was a financing mechanism. The Republican alternative for healthcare was a financing mechanism. We have very little debate and discussion on what to do to change the price of healthcare. We debate who gets to pay. Are we ready to legalize the technology that we've learned? Look at telemedicine. Before the pandemic, it was a very controversial subject. It's not going to work. Seniors won't use it. Well, now we know that's wrong. Price looks like we could do some great things on the price structure. Adoption, satisfaction is through the ceiling. Expand the definition of what telemedicine is. Is telemedicine doing what we're doing right now, talking into cameras? Or is it the thing I can wear on my wrist that monitors my blood oxygen, my pulse rate, for someone like myself, I have severe asthma, helping me manage my health situation and letting the algorithm ultimately make the decision, do I have to take my inhaled steroids? There are wearable sensors. And there's even ones you can put on your wall if you don't want to wear them. And the algorithm data is here. It's here. It's been here for a couple of years. But our regulatory reimbursement structure actually impairs that. And the lobbying class is often defending legacy economic models. How do you make that part of infrastructure? Saying, if we're going to have the revolution of what the future looks like, think about it holistically altogether. And it turns out infrastructure may be as much, the road that helps us move commerce as my ability to use technology to keep me healthy.
Absolutely brilliant. Congressman Schweikert, I could talk to you all day because I love big ideas that matter, that have consequence. We always have a good time. I'd love to do it. We'll have to get you in the studio one day when we're allowed to do that. But Congressman David Schweikert of Arizona, senior member of the Joint Economic Committee, thank you for I wanted to have a forum today on big ideas, kind of break out of our little grooves, and you've set the perfect tone. And so I just want to say thank you so much for doing that for us today.
Thanks, Steve.
We'll see you soon. More than 10 million Americans are without a job today, a number that's nearly twice that of the pre-pandemic era. As leaders in Washington debate additional assistance via stimulus checks, other measures, and as we just talked with Dave Schweikert, some people are looking at LLCs, finding other ways to get their economic picture together. I'm glad now to be joined by two of the smartest economists on this topic. Naylor Richardson is the chief economist at ADP, and William Spriggs, the chief economist at AFL-CIO. Good to see you, William. It's always great to have you on. And Naylor, welcome to our little world here where we kind of throw ideas on the wall and see what sticks. William, you and I have talked about it before, and I guess what I want to have a conversation with you two right now is, and I don't want to gloss over it, is what we do in a time of crisis, new president in place, new Congress in. How does the social contract need to be reorganized in a real way to solve a lot of the inequity problems? Let me start with William, because you and I have talked about this before.
Well, we actually saw it in the data on union membership last year. Surprising to many people, union membership didn't decline as much as employment, so union density went up. And it seems to be quite clear that a part of that reason was you have management and workers being able to talk within a structure that eases how do we handle a situation like what we're going through. So those companies that actually had a partner that they could sit down with, that had a structure in which workers had leave, had paid sick days, it was easier to figure out how do I rearrange my workplace and keep people, as opposed to I don't have anybody to talk to.
Sure.
This is one of the most important parts of what unions do, and a lot of people miss that because a lot of people just want to talk about what we do for wages, hours, benefits, which is very important. But this is another very important thing, is to create that setting, President Biden has says that he wants to improve our labor laws and pass the PRO Act, the way in which we can organize, to actually affirmatively give Americans the right to organize. And I think that's going to be an important step in making our workplaces easier to manage and to adapt to situations like this,
Right.
but also to adapt to new technologies.
Neil, how do you see this? And just to hit on the point on William said that union density has gone up, and I've been thinking about this. Two things can be simultaneously true. You can have greater union density. You can even have the administration talking about getting more union jobs out there, but you can also see more traditional jobs go gig. You can also see more people scrambling to pay the bills, by having 3 or 4 or 5. I mean, both of those can be possibly true at the same time. And I'm just wondering how you, at a time of crisis, kind of get the patterns right. So, I mean, ADP is like the Wizard of Oz. You know everything going on out there with workers, employers, benefits. How would you advise folks to think about the social contract?
Well, great to be with you. And you're right. We at ADP provide payroll services for about 26 million workers in the U.S. So we have a good grip on what people are interested in and what's going on in the job market. And I'd like to take you back to December, because what we saw was job loss. This economy was fairly strong going into the pandemic, but it had a lot of pre-existing conditions, some of them centuries in the making. And every thread of inequality that a pandemic could pull was pulled. And so what we've seen is that workers that are unprotected, and they happen to be those low income workers, have borne the brunt of job losses. So when you talk about the social contract and the resetting of the economy, it's not about a reset that goes back to where we were. It's a reset that acknowledges the inequalities that existed pre-pandemic, were amplified during the pandemic, and need to be solved post-pandemic. And we're seeing employers do just that at ADP. There is more concern about both the physical and the mental well-being of workers and what that looks like when we go back into the office. So I think we start there. We start with the basics, how to have a healthy and both mentally and physically strong workforce.
Thank you, William. What are the president's talked a lot about $15 jobs, and I had somebody on the other day talking about both unions and, the AFGE actually on here talking about there were a lot of federal workers, for instance, that make less than $15 an hour, which I hadn't realized. So there's a whole dimension there. If you were going to name 2 or 3 of the biggest things the administration could put in place right away to both address the economy but the state of the workforce today and compensation, what would they be?
So included in what the president has put forth is the Raise the Wage Act that the House passed last year and has been reintroduced by Congressman Scott, who chairs the House Education and Labor Committee. And this gets to Dr. Richardson's point about not resetting to where we started, because one of the things we understood was that we had too many Americans who had no liquidity. And that kind of household liquidity can only come from being paid decent wages. And so including getting everybody to $15 an hour is really to strengthen our labor force, to make it so that it's going to be more resilient. We need resiliency within the household sector. And this particular set of workers who were hit, I can only say, just from the political economy of it, right? If instead of this sector, and instead of a bug that attacked humans, we had a bug that attacked computers and forced us to shut down Wall Street because we feared that someone was going to, take all the money out of our banks. You can rest assured that no one would have sat by and said, oh, we're going to lay off all the workers on Wall Street. In 2 seconds, they would have come up with a plan. So even the attitude towards workers who are low wage, the attitude towards workers who are not unionized and don't have a voice, all of that has to change. So the multiple layers of inequality that she referred to, well, this is one of those keys. making workers more resilient so that they can have the room to withstand shocks, and we have some respect for them.
Yeah, thank you for that. Neil, let me ask you a question. When I was working on some of these economic issues and benefits issues in the 1990s, is Naila, can we get Naila back up? I hope. We had a question about how these benefits were attached to corporations where they worked. And I remember, trying to put forward legislation under Senator Bingaman at that time that it would allow people to have a pension and with kind of a reverse match that employers could put money in first without necessarily the employee putting them in, and that could follow them from position to position, faster vesting and all of this stuff, because it seemed like we had a turbocharged economy, but we weren't giving workers the ability to work through that. Do you, as far as a reset, big ideas, do we need to get bolder to think about how we package benefits in ways that travel with people as opposed to just be stuck with the companies where they work?
Yes, of course. I mean, that's why we're in the middle of a K-shaped recovery. Hopefully it is a recovery. It's for sure K-shaped. You've seen asset prices go through the roof, house prices. You've seen the stock market soar. All the while, those low-income workers have not enjoyed the benefits of a tech-driven K-shaped recovery. But let's not make our ideas so big that we don't understand that the basics are still vastly underserved. Let's talk about women in the workforce, women who've left the workforce at 4 times the rate of men because they have more care for children, for relatives. How do we support women as they re-enter and help them re-enter the workforce through childcare benefits? So I like big ideas too, and I'm the big proponent of broadband, but for a woman to get to work, they need reliable childcare. That was true in the 1980s, the 90s. It's true now. It doesn't change.
Well, are there any other dimensions, just real short form, that if you were to critique the Biden plan, say they've got some blind spots that need to be fixed, William and Naila, what would you put in the mix? William?
Well, I'm very happy that the president has talked about expanding childcare access, and that's part of infrastructure. If you think of infrastructure as what helps me get to work, now we all have a lot more understanding of how important support services are and those kind of things, those kind of services. But the unemployment insurance system is totally collapsed, and I had hoped that this package would provide enough money to do a transition to a different unemployment insurance system, because sooner rather than later, we're going to see massive retrenchments in state unemployment insurance plans, and that's going to exacerbate the disparity in who gets unemployment insurance that we already saw during this recovery.
Thank you. Naila, what are the blind spots you see?
Just to add to Dr. Spriggs' great point so far, I would say I'd like to see a more targeted approach. The COVID pandemic has not been uniform or democratic in the way it's affected households. And so there are some communities, the African American community, for instance, there are some sectors, leisure and hospitality and transportation, that have been hit harder than other sectors. So going forward, I'd like to see Congress and the administration work together for targeting those most impacted, whether it's small business or vulnerable households, those that are most impacted by this pandemic.
Well, listen, it's very sobering and very eye-opening to talk to the two of you about what we still need to do. Thanks so much for joining our program today and sharing your thoughts. Naila Richardson, Chief Economist with ADP. I'm a client of ADP, I should say. William Spriggs, Chief Economist at AFL-CIO. Thank you both for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Now let's get a sense for what the business community hopes will get done this year. Welcome Tom Donahue, the Chief Executive Officer of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, who really needs no introduction. Everybody knows Tom Donahue. Tom, it's great to see you again, sir.
How are you?
I'm doing great. We're having fun here, thinking big ideas, and a lot of the big ideas on my mind are big ideas you've been talking about for a long time. reforming immigration and getting it in a way that's a net plus for the nation, infrastructure. I've been working with the chamber for years, but as you look at this moment, of an inflection point politically, how can we make it an inflection point economically? What's most on your mind?
Well, I believe that before we do anything, and while we're doing everything, we have got to work on the pandemic. This pandemic has been the first time in our modern history where we can understand and we can watch what happens when people can't go to work, when large portions of our economy are shut down, and at the same time, when extraordinary people in this country who kept working because we needed them to keep the electrical power going, keep the TVs on, to make sure food was delivered, to make sure the hospitals ran. We probably have a better understanding of the various different elements of our economy and who's been able to, in this environment, stand up and support others that haven't been able to work, and what it's going to take to get those who we'd like to have go back to work, get there. And until we can, we face a very simple issue. There are only two things that drive economic growth. One is investment capital, and we've got it. And two, are people ready, willing, and able to go to work? And that means the ones we have, we want to retrain, get them in new jobs, so those that are not working, handle some of the issues your previous guests were talking about, and then move very clearly to have an immigration bill. And I think that'll get done.
Tom, one of the things, this is sort of off script, but one of the things that has been on my mind is two elements. The pandemic, talking to Senator Bill Frist, yesterday, Anthony Fauci, Francis Collins, more than enough people out there that said, we shouldn't have been caught flat-footed. There should have been greater preparation and understanding. In fact, there was planning. And then when you saw states and hospital systems competing in the law of the jungle for hospital gowns and respirators that we were in, when you go from a just-in-time, high-trust business and economy to a high fear when everyone's hoarding, you have a heart attack in the country, right? That's sort of what happened when you're describing. Do you believe we're going to get back to that high-trust world where you have just-in-time vaccines, just-in-time PPE, and that we can get back to a normality that people can have confidence that tomorrow's going to be better? Because that's really what we need.
Well, I'm not sure we were ever in that much of a high trust time. Americans are great. They respond very well in these times of crisis, but in doing so, they have a lot of people they're going to blame about why it happened, how it happened, why it's not going the way I would do it if I were in charge. But when you really look at it, we're doing pretty well. I'm a little upset with everybody jumping all over the states right now about the dispensing of vaccines. Normally we'd have, if we were trying to get vaccines around, we'd have the whole healthcare system. That healthcare system right now is taking care of a lot of seriously ill people. Nurses are working 60-hour shifts. Doctors are living at the hospital. Ambulance drivers and paramedics are engaged in every way. So I think we ought to just figure out how we bring some more people into helping us do this, make notes of the things we want to complain about later and fix, and then go forward. But I'll give you an idea. If 5 years ago, whoever happened to be president went up to the Congress and said, look, we need billions and billions of dollars because we're going to have a pandemic someday, and we need all of these services, materials. How do you think the Congress would have responded? Today, the Congress is saying, why didn't they do it? Then they would have said, well, we're going to spend that money on something else. We haven't had a pandemic in a long time. We'll get to that next year. The point I'm trying to make, you deal with your problems when they happen. You hope that we take our experience and plan for redundancy. The one people that do this great are our military. What you do in a military, it's redundancy, redundancy, redundancy. That's how you win battles. That's how you serve national needs. But you can't do that in the private sector as easily as you might like.
Tom, do you support the president's COVID relief package request from Congress is about $1.9 trillion? Because I remember talking to one of your staff a couple of years ago saying, how much infrastructure does America need? And they said somewhere of about $2 trillion. So I guess my question is, are these necessarily an offset against each other? Do you think the president can get the COVID relief package and then we have enough resources to look at a big infrastructure investment in the country?
The answer is yes, and now let me explain that. I think the president will get a COVID relief package. He decided today or yesterday that he wasn't going to break it into pieces, and he's right. Keep it as a single entity, and he'll have an easier time getting the votes. But I think he also knows that some of the things in that package are going to change. That's why we have a Congress, a Senate, and an administration, and they're going to work it out. And by the way, I think they're going to lean more favorably to helping our fellow citizens. But there's a lot of things in this package. For example, I'm not sure that we think that the aid should be timely, and it should be temporary, and it should be targeted. So I'm not sure whether people that make $300,000 a year need to get up to $2,000 checks. One of the things we all worry about when a lot of these people get a lot of that money, we'd love them to have it, but they may not come back to work. There are issues like, and I'll raise it before you do, what about a $15 minimum wage? Well, there are places in this country that people are paid $15 in minimum wages. There are places, if that's what you required, they'd close down because, I mean, if you run a donut shop in certain places around this country and you pay people $15 an hour, you're out of business. And so I think he will get a program. We will support that program, but in the process of getting there will be some appropriate changes. Second, to the question of an infrastructure bill, I've been pushing this for 20 years. I used to run the whole program for the truckers in this country. We desperately need an infrastructure program. Now, what has that got in it? Clearly, roads, bridges, and keep our transit working. On the other hand, we know we're going to have to do something on broadband, and everybody's talking about that. Then there are people that are talking about infrastructure, and they're saying, well, we have to do housing, and we have to do this, we have to do that. Excuse me, we've got to segment that out. If you want to do some of those things, go somewhere else and get the money. But we need an infrastructure program. Will it have some things to do with the environment? Probably. But the more things you add to the program, the more you go back to our fundamental problem.
Right.
Over the last 20 some odd years, we have come up with many bipartisan infrastructure programs to hear the same refrain. It's a great idea, but we don't have the money. Well, I would say, why don't we just put 25 cents on the fuel price and then index it, and you have enough money to go forward for quite a while and build roads, bridges, and take care of transit, period. And presidents and legislators of both parties said, but Tom, that's a tax. Really looking for a way we could pay for it without letting people know it really was a tax. And we collect less money now on the road, not because of the pandemic. The car you're driving today has much better miles per gallon than the one you drove 20 years ago.
Right.
Therefore, collect less money. And I think there are all sorts of issues there. If we want an infrastructure program, we just have to do it, because that'll do three things. Good jobs are the way we're going to get the people. Very, very big time increases in safety and reduction in accidents. And by the way, a massive increase in productivity, so people aren't sitting around in places when they ought to be on the way to work or whatever else they have to do.
Well, Tom Donahue, it's a big idea. Particularly, I think everybody ought to pay attention when the U.S. Chamber is actually in support of any kind of tax. I wanted to discuss immigration with you, but we're going to have to hold that to our next time. Thank you so much for joining us today, Tom. It's great to see you and for your big ideas. Thanks so much.
Well, thanks. Keep up the good work. This is an important time to get people to play in the game. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. So we are going to go even deeper into the topic we've been talking to. So let's talk more about infrastructure. My next guest is a big advocate of bridging the digital divide to reach rural America and underserved urban areas. Welcome, Stacey Plaskett, the Congresswoman from the Virgin Islands, who is also the senior whip in the Democratic caucus. Thank you so much, Representative Plaskett, for joining us today. Let me ask you, and we had Congressman Schweikert on earlier, and he said, look, we're not thinking about infrastructure the right way. We can't look at it as just roads and bridges. It's a digital dimension. It's connectivity. It's sensors. How do you define what kind of infrastructure we need to be working on?
Well, I agree with that. And I think that we really need to take a step back and look at this in a historical context. When America was in its greatest expansion, at the end of the day, the federal government recognized that railroads were going to be a connectivity between people and jobs and things, right? And so we were willing to invest in that. In the same way, broadband is in some respects our transportation and a mechanism by which we are transporting goods and services as well. And this last mile of that connectivity has to be taken care of. When we talk about infrastructure, and I was great to hear the chamber all in favor of an infrastructure package. And when we say let's do it, we have waited an inordinate amount of time for the private sector to take up the slack on that last mile. And there are areas of America that they just do not see the profitability in doing that the government has had now needs to take up that slack. We've seen through the COVID pandemic what happens if we don't do that. We have neighborhoods, rural areas where children are not able to study properly because of the lack of broadband and a lack of connectivity in that last mile. We've also seen in very urban areas and underserved urban areas, children who are 10 blocks from Wall Street not able to have connectivity in their homes specifically. And so I think that the cost of not doing that is tremendous. And it is not fiscally prudent for us not to find. So I think broadband is an expansive term. I think it is the modern day transportation. And for us to have goods and services, for people to be able, for small entrepreneurs, to be able to be connected to their goods and services, that we've got to get it done.
Congresswoman, I can't help but ask this, but former Vice President Mike Pence happens to be in the Virgin Islands right now. I don't know if anybody knows in the U.S. Virgin Islands. Sort of maybe he was hiding out, but social media kind of caught him, and he's down there. If he were to walk around and kick around the Virgin Islands, what is the quality of broadband connectivity there?
That's a great question. And it's so funny. It seems to be the vice president home. When our President Biden was the vice president, St. Croix was the home that he went to for his Christmas and Easter holidays. And we'll welcome Vice President Pence as well. Everyone's welcome. But the one thing you will note, which is very, very unique in the Virgin Islands, is that the Virgin Islands itself, and St. Croix specifically, has more broadband capacity than anywhere in the United States, because Global Crossing put their hub between South America and North America off of the island of St. Croix. So the capacity and the data capacity on the island is tremendous. But we have very, very slow connectivity for many of our housing communities, our schools, many homes in the Virgin Islands. The cost of doing business there is really difficult. Additionally, because our electricity is so high, we need to also, and this goes into investing in renewable energy, driving down the cost of energy in areas we're not able to take advantage of it because of the cost of utility. Place like Washington, D.C., people don't even know how much they pay per kilowatt, but it's usually between 11 and 14 cents. But every Virgin Islander knows how much they pay for kilowatt, which is between 36 and sometimes 43 cents per kilowatt.
Wow, that is, I mean, I just happened to start looking at my own side because you get these choices. It's very confusing, but I know that that is a whopping large gap between what is here and what is there. So we have a question.
You know where that comes out in is when a data storage company is deciding we love to have the capacity of the Virgin Islands, but the cost of electricity and the coolant, it just doesn't make business sense for us. Or on the other spectrum, our elderly, when they're looking at living on fixed incomes and they're saying, do I pay for food or do I pay my electric bill? It becomes really difficult decisions.
That's very, very sobering. We have a question from Andrew Braun, so the advisor of EXP, who asks, will there be major infrastructure funding? We're talking about infrastructure, and as Tom Donahue just mentioned, as David Schweikert mentioned, Representative Schweikert, what is your sense, your gut feeling when you talk to folks that you're on the committee with? Are they behind a serious infrastructure spending bill that would address the core issues of the country? Because as you've said, it has been a long time in need. I've been talking about infrastructure, I think, for a decade now. We see the crumbling bridges, crumbling roads. We've also seen an upgrade in technology and what we can learn from it. And that helps with conservation. But I have to tell you, I just sort of feel like I've been here 3 or 4 times where everybody said we needed infrastructure and it didn't end up coming around. What's your gut feeling?
Well, I don't want to take the thunder away from the one of the other guests you're having, which is Pete DeFazio, who chairs the Transportation Infrastructure Committee, and I'm sure he has a lot to say about it, as well as others. But I think there's a real belief in the minds of members of Congress that infrastructure is something that we inherently know is important and something that needs to be done. But coupled with the COVID pandemic and our need to increase economic growth and to spur it, to jumpstart it as we build back better than before the pandemic and trying to spur our economy, infrastructure just seems to be a natural mechanism by which we can do that. So we're solving the problem of our crumbling infrastructure, the needs that we've had before this, coupled with the necessity to try and grow jobs, try to stimulate the economy, try and get things moving again. It just seems a natural fit that infrastructure would be the way. Last year, the House passed H.R. 2, the Moving Forward Act, which was a great roadmap for Congress to use when crafting legislation for this year. That package included legislation that works to tackle the threat of climate change through tax codes, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, as well as creating new jobs and getting people back to work on the smart path forward and the essential well-being for the future generations. So I think that, there's a coupling that's going to take place between the need to grow our economy and the staggering need for rebuilding that is going to, create a perfect storm, if you will, and something has to move forward.
Congresswoman, I want to ask you just one last quick question, and it's going to be an unfair, perhaps uncomfortable question. I mean, you're very cool. We're talking about policy. We've been talking about, the digital divide, inequality, equity, what wages should look like, infrastructure. I mean, it's been a real delight all morning. But sometimes I got to tell you, when I even open The Hill, when I open up other publications, they're focused on, what did Matt Gaetz do in Wyoming? There seems to be a gap between surface noise and, high octane policy. And so I want to make you, uncomfortable. Do you think the Congress, as we think about reset, is going to be shifting more towards real discussions of policy, maybe less away from theatrics?
Well, I think what happened January 6th and the aftermath, the the uncivil war that President Biden spoke about in his inauguration is not theatrics, it's real. And I think that we as members of Congress need to deal with both. We need to work on policy. I sit on the Ways and Means Committee, where we're really digging into issues of how do we create tax initiatives to really support and jumpstart our economy? How do we create and support social investment, SNAP, Medicare, Medicaid, earned income tax credit, and child tax credit? But at the same time, we have to deal with those issues that create an environment in which we're able to do that, where members feel safe. And, I have 5 children. And one day, one child has a great report card, and the next time, later that day, you're responding to a teacher calling you into a parent-teacher conference about one who's not had such a great day. And you've got to deal with both. And I think members of Congress are going to have to do the same.
Well, Representative Stacey Plaskett, member of the House Ways and Means Committee from the Virgin Islands, this is our first time beginning the show. I love talking to you, and I hope you'll come back. Thank you so much.
I'd love it. And coffee sometime.
Excellent. We will look forward to that. Thank you much, and we'll see you next time. Thanks for helping us to talk Reset. Our next guest embraced technology to maximize infrastructure's capacity to serve communities as both Transportation Secretary in the Obama administration and the Mayor of Charlotte. I love talking to this guy. Anthony Fox is still doing that today as the Chief Policy Officer at Lyft. Mr. Secretary, it's great to see you. And, we've talked before about how a lot of the choices this country made in big investments sort of screwed some folks and helped other folks. Yeah. There was a divide. I guess, I've asked you this before, so I know your answer, but my question is, are we at the moment where we're going to undo some of that and redo it in a way that gets the kind of broad equity and fairness in this country that people deserve?
Well, Steve, first of all, it's great to join you. And when we were having this conversation just 5 or 6 years ago, I think the climate was very different. Americans have now seen George Floyd laid bare on the street. And there's an entirely different conversation about equity today that I think gives an opening for policymakers to do things that I was not able to do because we did not have the authorities within the U.S. Department of Transportation to do so. But I do believe we're in a different day, and I am hoping and optimistic that the Biden administration will put equity at the top of the list.
How are you enjoying Lyft? I need to ask this and have a little fun. I interviewed the founders of Lyft many years ago. They brought their moms. It was cool. Now they're kind of mega stars and zillionaires. I don't know if they'll still take my call, but it's a big change when you look at just a few years. 4G, somebody told me, at Qualcomm, 4G got us Lyft and Uber. It enabled people to create very different platforms, very different opportunities in business and their own economics. 5G is going to even revolutionize that further. I just love to kind of get a deep dive about, Lyft land and as you look at technology coming in, smarter cities, smarter transportation. Give us what are we not seeing and talking about that you know about that I don't?
Well, I think there are a couple of things. We certainly are at a point where the transportation industry is going to explode in terms of the different technologies that can be utilized. And we still need government regulation to help some of those technologies. And I would point to drones and autonomous vehicles as one example. In fact, we put guidance out there back in 2016 that I think still is probably the cornerstone of what government needs to do in terms of attacking those things. But actually, I think it's connected to the equity conversation as well. Technology is frankly neutral. It is neither good nor bad unless we make it into something that creates a stronger fabric and a more efficient and effective transportation system. So one of the things I really believe is that transportation can be a unifying element in this country, and that's part of what I'm trying to do in the role I'm playing at Lyft, and it's what I tried to do in government.
How many people get it? And when you go into Congress and they, I have a reasonable understanding of Lyft, and I do a reasonable amount of discussions about smart cities, autonomous vehicles. I've seen one of your autonomous vehicles, in fact, in a test. But what is the level of excitement? What's the level of concern about that future when you talk to members of Congress and the administration?
I think there's a lot of concern. Again, anything that's new is has to be understood first. And, in the context of things like autonomous vehicles, there's obviously safety concerns, privacy concerns, all sorts of things that have to be figured out. But I think the message that I tried to deliver as Transportation Secretary, and that I think is also still true today, is that the future is coming. The technology is coming, and our responsibility is to try to make it as much of a positive as we possibly can, and to basically mobilize it to help us solve problems that maybe we haven't been able to solve before.
What are the biggest problems, Anthony, you have with mayors? I've got Mayor Francis Suarez, who's become a friend of mine down in Miami. What kind of, you know cities, and, what kind of trouble is he causing you?
Well, we would love to get some of our micro-mobility tools on the street. We've got a great bike share program down there that many people across America have been using to manage their transportation needs in the wake of COVID as an alternative to getting in a car or other means.
So break that down for our lay audience. Micro-mobility, bike share. Tell them. There's scooters, bikes,
scooters, even walking. But in our case, it's a bike and scooter program that people making short trips to the grocery store or the pharmacy can use those instead of hopping in a car. And it's been incredibly useful. And obviously, because of COVID, when you're out in the open air, it's a little easier to feel safer than when you're kind of confined into a car. So anyway, that would be one message directly to Mayor Suarez. But I think largely mayors get the joke. They know that the country, the alternatives to transportation are necessary. They know that that the ecosystem of transportation is expanding, and that the first and last mile that rideshare can offer can be a net benefit to cities, and micromobility is coming in a real way, and it's actually a net positive for the environment. It's a net positive for access, and it's a net positive for health. So I think mayors are actually very, very critical, and they also understand much more intuitively how all these things come together.
Anthony, take your Lyft hat off for a minute, and you put your former big poobah in transportation, hat on. And one of the other people I had the privilege of interviewing years ago was Pete Buttigieg. When he was mayor in St. Paul, and guess what? He's getting your old job. So what's the biggest first mistake he's going to make, and what's the biggest piece of advice you have for him?
I have a lot of confidence in Secretary Designate Buttigieg. I think he's incredibly bright. He's bringing a perspective as a former mayor, and I think my only advice to him is to trust his gut. There are going to be a lot of people who have technical expertise, which is critical in the role. But he learned a lot as mayor about how all this stuff comes together, and what things work and what things don't work when it comes to policy. And not to get too stuck in the bubble in Washington, and to trust his South Bend instincts.
Oh, I think that's a really good bit of advice, and exactly right, South Bend. But I want to ask one last question, and I don't know where this is going to come out, but Lyft, Uber, you've been under some tension, especially about your relationship with those who drive. And, it's a bigger question as things evolve, right? We just had somebody from the AFL-CIO on. Joe Biden keeps talking about union jobs and, that needing more, high-quality union jobs. The question of defining our relationship with work, our relationship with benefits, is it with companies, is it individual and not? And I just sort of feel like there's this vast wasteland of undeveloped area in getting a fairer, better social contract that gives people nimbleness in that. Now, I know you're thinking about it, but is there anything you can share about how we can all be better and smarter about how we think about those issues?
Well, I think the first thing is to just notice that, a significant part of our workforce, not just with respect to rideshare, but it is in that sort of gray zone that you're talking about. And, I think that all of the stakeholders, be it labor, government, private sector folks, I think we have a responsibility to come together and to try to figure out how to make the best out of what we've got. Flexible work is, in the case of drivers, they support it, 4-to-1, and so they want the flexibility. But obviously, there's a need for a stronger safety net. There's a need to ensure that there's a minimum earning standard and things like that. And I think those are things that we have been open to, remain open to. But, the other part of it, Steve, is that, we've spent the last 100 years managing kind of a labor environment that has been more based on bilateral agreements between, a company and a labor union. And what happens when you have a sector of worker who sort of flows freely between different platforms, so that, you can't necessarily have a bilateral agreement with Lyft when the driver may be driving for Lyft and Uber and DoorDash and anything else. And so I think there's a square peg in a round hole problem here. And we're open to working with anyone who wants to work with us to solve it. I really believe this is really important right now, particularly as many people are looking for work, falling into poverty and other things. And so making every job as good as it can be is really important.
Well, Anthony, it's great to see you again, and I'm going to have to get Secretary Designate Buttigieg on with you and compare notes on this. But thank you so much for always accepting my call to join us. Former Transportation Secretary, Chief Policy Officer Lyft, former Mayor of Charlotte, really good guy. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts on what we need to reset in this country. Thank you, Anthony.
Always a pleasure. Thank you.
Our aging physical infrastructure was excuse me, let me get that right. This has been a long day. Our aging physical infrastructure was a problem before the pandemic, but now the need for modernization has intensified and will be all indications will be a top priority for Congress this next year. You already heard him mentioned earlier. Somebody name-checked him, a former congresswoman who just said, Congressman Pete DeFazio may have some big news. We'll have to see in a moment. The chairman of the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. Congressman, great to see you again. We had Congresswoman Stacey Plaskett on a little bit, and she said she didn't want to steal your thunder on some things you might talk about as far as a transportation infrastructure bill. She was very courteous of that. So I'm hoping for some, what are you cooking up on the transportation infrastructure front?
Well, you saw last summer we passed a major package out of the House called Moving Forward. The largest element was the INVEST Act, which came out of the Transportation Infrastructure Committee, and it was a plan to build a 21st century infrastructure for this country. I mean, we've been living off the Eisenhower legacy for more than half a century. It's fallen apart. 47,000 bridges need substantial repair replacement. 40% of the national highway system needs to be rebuilt, not just shovel-ready surfacing like done under Obama's so-called Recovery Act, and a $100 billion backlog to bring transit to a state of good repair, let alone give people new transit options. So it was a very ambitious bill. It did three principal objectives. One is rebuild the infrastructure, rebuild it in a way that is resilient to severe weather events due to climate change, sea level rise. In the West, we got to build it resilient to earthquakes, rebuild it with materials that'll last longer. I don't want to build any more 40, 60-year bridges. We're going to build 100-year bridges in this country. And then, secondly, we're going to also deal with the fact that surface transportation is the largest single carbon polluter in the United States. And we're going to electrify the National Highway Network. And we do that in partnership with the Energy Commerce Committee, who will expand the grid, put a lot of investment into renewable power, because the biggest gain obviously comes if you're recharging your cars, light trucks and heavy trucks with renewable energy. You come out way ahead. as opposed to using fossil fuels to charge them. And then finally, creating millions of jobs with some very ambitious worker training programs and targeting in particular areas, depressed rural areas, inner cities, minorities, to get them into the workforce with these good jobs, which are Davis-Bacon wages, because it's all federal money.
I can feel the energy and what you're talking about, the excitement of it. I mean, I'm excited. I love talking about infrastructure, but it's like one thing to talk about it, it's another thing to do it. So I want to applaud you for, getting to the point where we're actually doing this. We don't talk enough about, what's coming down the pike, what has been passed, and so that's great. We just had Tom Donahue on from the U.S. Chamber, who said that we need to do more, and that he would favor paying for some of this with a 25-cent gas tax, which was another historic moment for me today, because I couldn't imagine the U.S. Chamber president endorsing that. Would you favor such a gas tax, and are you on the same page as Tom Donahue?
The chamber has endorsed it. They haven't put anywhere near the energy behind it that they put behind the massive tax cuts. I hope they put more energy behind an infrastructure bill and funding. The Trucking Association supported an increase in the diesel tax. Even the independent truck drivers have supported it. But at this point, it appears the administration doesn't want to go that route. I don't know. I don't get to do it. I've proposed many different ways to pay for it. I've proposed during the Obama administration a barrel tax that would go to anything that goes into transportation, which would make it truly multimodal. Any fraction of a barrel of oil that went there. Actually, Rahm Emanuel told me in September that in the lame duck, Obama would support it. Well, of course, we lost the House. That was the end of that. And Obama had earlier killed my transportation bill because he was scared of the gas tax. At this point, I write the bill. I'm going to give them a bill, so to speak, not just a bill that does infrastructure, but a bill of right now, as written, the Invest Act would be $150 billion over projected revenues. There's a lot of ways to get there. People talk about rescinding some of the tax cuts. Other ways, I could justify borrowing at 2.3%. That's almost free money, 30-year treasuries, with a way to pay back those loans. That would be another way to go. But I don't get to do that part.
Congressman, is the Invest in America Act that you just defined, has that already been introduced?
No. We're going to wait for the administration. Obviously, I think the secretary or the incoming secretary gets named next Tuesday, I guess, or approved. I've had preliminary conversations with him. I've had conversations with the transition team, with senior folks with the Biden administration. They like the thrust of my legislation. They may maybe they want to go bigger. Maybe they want to modify parts of it. I'm happy to work with them. So we're just getting ready to move forward. We've been talking with stakeholders and making some adjustments to what we did last summer. But we're ready to move pretty quickly.
Congressman, I'm probably being unfair here to someone, but when I listen to someone I really respect, the Secretary-designate Pete Buttigieg, I'm very impressed by him. But when I listen to you, the micro detail that just runs off your lips about every dimension of this is really powerful. Or do you have confidence that Pete Buttigieg is going to be able to get tooled up to that level of micro detail soon enough?
He doesn't have to. I'll provide the micro detail for him. And I think he's going to be a great partner. And I think he's going to help elevate the profile of infrastructure. I mean, there's been a lot of talk about it. We had 7 infrastructure weeks during the Trump administration, and their net proposals were to reduce investment in infrastructure, or their first year was to give all the burden to the states. That's nuts. We tried that. I say to people, we tried that. Back in the 50s, I've got a great poster I take around with me. It's the brand new Kansas Turnpike, and it ends. You can't figure out what is that. Where are all those lines where this new road ends? Well, that's the state line with Oklahoma. Oklahoma couldn't build theirs. They said, "Oh, we got financial problems. We promised to build it, but we won't." And it ended in Amos Schweitzer's farm field until there was a federal program, 80% federal match. And then the road was completed through Oklahoma. So, that we have to have a federal partnership. You can't say,
Yeah.
LA, you will pay for all the infrastructure to move all the goods that come into the country to the Arizona border. Oh, Arizona, you'll pick it up there. I mean, that's nuts. This has to be a national effort.
Well, my family in Bartlesville, Oklahoma, appreciates you picking up the slack for them there. Congressman, last question. You had a tweet. I love your tweets, and they're very direct and very blunt. But you said, for decades, I have led efforts to fight policies that hurt U.S. manufacturing and destroy jobs. This past year, I passed an infrastructure bill in the House with some of the strongest Buy America provisions ever. Today, I applaud the White House for issuing the Made in America executive order. So I want to ask you one dimension about this. We talk a lot about Buy America. You have been talking about Buy America. Of course, that creates market power. That creates an opportunity to acquire lots of things made in America. But as we saw with the COVID impact, there are a lot of things we don't make here anymore that are made abroad. And so I'm just wondering what your sense is of the state of manufacturing in America today. What do we need to do by way to kind of create that capacity back in the country? Are the regulations in place? And frankly, is the consciousness in place?
Well, President Biden says he's going to use the Defense Production Act. Trump administration claimed they used it. They used it very sparingly to bring back manufacturing. Look, in World War II, the government went to Chrysler and said, build us 15,000 tanks. They said, well, what if the war ends? The government said, we'll still buy them. Same thing with airplanes. Same thing with ships. We need to show that the demand is going to be there and do this. I mean, right now, what I'm doing in the bill is closing loopholes for China. There is a wholly communist government-owned company that's trying to take over the rail industry in the U.S. Very, very predatory. And they're smart. They put a plant in the Richie Neal's district, the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee. But they're going to go away, or they're going to make things in America. They're not just going to ship stuff over here and have people in Springfield unwrap it and say it's made in America. We're going to change the standards. Same thing with BYD, a bus company that they put in Kevin McCarthy's district. Oh, gee, these guys aren't too dumb, are they? And the way we measure component value in transit is nuts. And most of these things, they're pretty crummy quality too, are made in China and assembled here with massive value attributed to putting pieces of the battery into a box. Not going to happen anymore. Make the stuff here. We can make these things. We have a lot of unemployed people in this country. We're going to have a big worker retraining program. We're going to get into communities that have been depressed for years. We're going to get into minority communities, and we're going to get these people in good jobs making things in this country again. And we're going to deal with a lot of our social problems and drugs and other things if we do this.
Well, Chairman DeFazio, Chairman of the House Transportation Infrastructure Committee, I will open the door that whenever you want to come and talk about that provision and how do you get America working again and solve some of these major, this is one of my favorite topics for decades, and we have not talked about it in the serious way that I think you bring to this. So the door's open. Anytime you want to come back, we'll do more of this for a longer bit of time.
I got a lot of thoughts. We could get into it a lot more another time. That'd be great. Thanks.
Well, Mr. Chairman, thank you so much. Even though we haven't seen any significant movement on the infrastructure front in a few years, although we just did see the Invest America Act and the Infrastructure Act that Chairman DeFazio just talked about, it's traditionally been an issue that's received bipartisan attention and a lot of support on Capitol Hill. I'm joined now by Congressman Sam Graves, the ranking member of the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. Thanks for joining me. So you just heard your partner in all of this on the other side. Where would you, Congressman Graves, sort of see the blind spots in that approach? What do you not? I mean, what I heard from Pete DeFazio was we need to make stuff in America. We got worries about Chinese, bus and infrastructure and train implants here. He almost sounds like a member of the GOP on some of this, right?
Well, and I completely agree with Peter on those items. Those things that you mentioned. He's exactly right. Yeah. And we've been working on an infrastructure package for some time. It seems like, we hear about it over and over and over again, and but it never gets produced. So, I'm hoping that we're able to do something. Our component's going to be a traditional surface reauthorization. This could, morph into a much larger infrastructure package, which could include many things outside our jurisdiction. But obviously, our part of it, I'm hopeful we're going to be able to get something done and move forward.
I love Chairman DeFazio's comment that he wished the chamber would put as much support behind their 25-cent a gas tax idea as tax cuts. But how do you feel about that? Are you on the same page with Tom Donahue that we need to find, a new tax on gas to help fund some of these projects?
Well, I don't think we need to be taxing gas at all. It's an extraordinarily regressive way to fund infrastructure, because we have vehicles on the road that are more and more and more efficient. They get more efficient as time goes on. We have a lot of vehicles on the road, in fact, a massive amount of vehicles on the road that don't use any gas. So, I think we need to pivot to something a little bit more equitable, something that brings in those dollars from individuals using the roads and bridges, and get those dollars in as a part of the process. It's a user fee is what it is, and we have a lot of people using that infrastructure that aren't paying for it.
I had one of your state colleagues, but also congressional colleagues on the other day, Blaine Lukemeyer, and we had a fascinating conversation about business and small business going on. But he said, President Biden's move on executive orders to stop the wall, to stop the Keystone Pipeline, disrupted tons of jobs, disrupted lots of things that are going on. That was a part of the pipeline, part of infrastructure as well. So I guess my question to you is, where are you with regard to some of these executive orders that are coming out? Are you one that says, hey, let's slow down, build us in?
Oh, absolutely. And there are, thousands upon thousands of jobs that were disrupted as a result of that. And the way I look at this, it actually goes beyond, President Biden. Congress has been allowing this to take place through one administration after the other, and I go back as far as President Bush, and then through President Obama, and then President Trump, and now President Biden. And we continue to cede a lot of our authority to the executive branch and allow a lot of these things to happen through executive order. And I very much disagree with that process. I think this should be legislation to change. We are the elected representatives of our various districts. And so I'm very frustrated by this trend that we have seen over time, again, through Republican administrations, Democrat administrations, and it's disturbing to me. And I just, it's frustrating that, with one stroke of the pen, one individual can remove that many jobs in that many places, or just completely, displace those individuals on jobs that were already started.
What would be at the height of your list? And one of the areas that I'm really interested in is like the future of transportation. We've had guys on there were the head of, the CEO of Hyperloop, or we've had people in, looking at high-speed rail. I mean, I don't want to go through all the dimensions because I don't even know them all. But when you look at air transport, high-speed transport, various kinds of this, and you look at the backlog of all the infrastructure spending that we need to do, how do you get the equilibrium right between fixing the old and investing in the new? I don't want to say cool to be cool, but to me they're cool, but the new and different, more efficient, big strategic leaps forward in transportation. And do you have any kind of map you can share with us, which is, the sort of Sam Graves, wish list of the future?
Well, that's a challenging part, to be honest with you. And you have to think outside the box. And that gets very hard when you talk about technologies that are just emerging or in their infancy moving forward. But we have to take care of that traditional infrastructure. But as we move forward, we have to think about these things. It's just like with when you're building roads and you've got autonomous vehicles, that are getting better and better and better all the time. And it's just fascinating, some of the opportunities and the technologies that are out there. We need to be thinking about, should we be building roads differently? Should we be, embedding technology in these roads so that autonomous vehicles, for instance, can utilize them, instead of going back and having to tear everything up and start all over again. And so it's a challenge. It really is. That's one of the principles when it comes to, Republicans on our side, when it comes to putting together the next transportation bill or service transportation bill, is we need to try to do everything we can to think outside the box and make sure that we are implementing those things that need to be implemented so that we don't stifle that technology. We foster it and let it grow.
It's fun to talk to Tom Donahue. He's kind of a character. Sorry, Tom, if you're watching, I love talking to him. But it's one of these things. He says, well, we've been looking at working for infrastructure, for a long time. But we'll get members of Congress and governors and mayors say, we agree with you, Tom, but we wish we could afford it. Right now we're in a major crisis, and so I'm wondering, is this crisis big enough to be able to generate the justification for budgets that you think and appropriations you think can get through? Because I know that at some point somebody's going to begin blowing the whistle again on America's debt level and the living beyond our means question, which hasn't seemed to come up for a few years. But I'm just wondering, I know you're a fiscal conservative, and so how do you balance the investment that we need to make with being fiscally responsible?
Well, first of all, in transportation, we still have true trust funds. When your gas tax dollars are paid for at the pump, they don't go into general revenue and then come back out. They go into the highway trust fund, and those dollars are to be used for highway projects. We have the aviation trust fund. We have the inland waterways trust fund. We have the harbor maintenance trust fund, and these are user fees generated, and they go into these programs. Now, going back to the first question that you raised, and that is the gas tax, and continuing to depend on that to fund, traditional, at least in roads and bridges, when it comes to surface transportation, the highway trust fund's going broke because we do have more of those vehicles on the road that don't pay for the use of that road. They aren't burning gasoline or diesel fuel. We have more and more efficient vehicles. So we're going to have to find a way to continue to fund roads and bridges to the extent that they need to be funded. And infrastructure is something that the government should do and should do well. And I've always said that. But we have to figure out a way to make sure that we fund it moving forward. So when we talk about infrastructure, at least transportation infrastructure, we want to make sure that we keep those true trust funds and we don't see those dollars siphoned off for other uses, other sectors. We want to make sure that we maintain that, but we also got to make sure that they are fiscally sound and,
right.
And we have the dollars we need to do the work.
Congressman, I know I'm going to throw you one more curveball real quick, but I know that this isn't necessarily the domain of your committee and what you do, but I know you think about it a bit. When you think about the future of infrastructure, let's just say we get a lot of money, we put a lot of infrastructure, it gets developed. It's all going to be smart. As we talked with David Schweikert at the beginning, we're going to have sensors embedded. It's going to be an entirely different level of digital capacity built into the infrastructure that we have, waterways, air systems. You and I have talked about the waterway issues before. Whenever you're doing that, there's a question of cybersecurity. There's a question of nefarious players coming in to undermine American confidence in those systems, the data that comes back. To what degree is your committee and your colleagues concerned in thinking about, as you're making these decisions, building in cyber protections and cybersecurity? I know maybe that's an obvious answer, but I see so many things getting hacked. It is top of mind for me.
Well, it's not an obvious answer, and it's something that we need to be very diligent about. And again, it's thinking outside the box and trying to outthink those folks that would want to do harm to the United States. And it's just tough. It really is. We've often heard people say that a terrorist or somebody that's trying to disrupt our infrastructure system, they only have to be right once, but we got to be right every single day trying to find these attempts, these hacks, whether that's coming from a foreign country like China or Russia, or it's coming from an individual that's just wanting to disrupt everything. It's it's a potential problem. So we got to continue to think outside the box, and the more we depend on that technology, the more vulnerable we are. And it doesn't matter if it's transportation; that goes with anything. It's a much different world today than it was just 20 years ago. a much different world and a much more vulnerable world as well. So yeah, that has to be, it's part of the equation. It's something that we have to think about.
Well, Congressman Sam Graves, Missouri ranking member of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. I always enjoy our conversations. And I say this in a light way, that I know things have started out sort of tense in town here when you come into town. I hope all of you begin to have some fun with some of this, because that matters too.
Well, it does matter. And that's one of the downsides, I guess. And one of the things I've seen change in Congress since I've been here is we don't have nearly as much, I don't know if I want to use the word camaraderie or friendships developed. We have, people on the extreme right and people on the extreme left that it seems like they just want to, to disrupt the process rather than coming together, where the majority of us in the middle are, rather than coming together and working on solutions and legislation. And it's been really hard this last year. One of the ways that we do that, or you get to know people on the other side of the aisle, is through Codels and being able to look at, in our case, transportation projects around the world, and you get to know those individuals, and it certainly helps when it comes to, working on legislation. We haven't seen that for a while. We have a lot of freshman members that have never experienced that opportunity, and we have a lot of freshman members that simply don't want to get to know their colleagues, and I think that has hurt the process in a big way. There's just a lot of anger and pushback, and again, it's it isn't very productive.
Well, I really appreciate your comments. I had Congressman Darrell Issa on before all of you got sworn in, and it was like incoming freshman, but of course he's the once and future congressman, right? He's done it and coming back. And I said, how do you break over that, exactly along the line? He said, Steve, he says, I think it's really important that every member of Congress go find someone they don't know, or someone that even may be irritated at them, and say, let's have coffee. You may not agree on everything, but it was an interesting icebreaker that I give Congressman Issa credit for. So thanks so much for sharing your views. I really appreciate you taking our calls and joining us so much. So thank you, Congressman Graves, and good luck with your work.
Thanks.
My next guest was an economic advisor for President Trump, and he was really the economic advisor in my book. He made headlines recently saying he supports President Biden's $1.9 trillion rescue plan. Welcome Kevin Hassett, Vice President and Managing Director at the Lindsay Group. Some of you may remember Larry Lindsay, another great national economic advisor, and he's a distinguished visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution. Kevin, I don't think I'm outing myself or anything, saying, hey, you're a friend, and I really appreciate you coming on.
20 years, right?
Yeah,
if the old is probably operative.
Exactly. But I just want to say, we're at a point. I had Senator Tim Scott on the other day, and I talked to Senator Scott, and I said, do you remember when I first talked to you? It was about something called opportunity zones, which of course he's very supportive of.
Right.
I said, I was the one that hosted.
Did it at one of these events. Yeah.
I hosted you and big time Democrat liberal Jared Bernstein. You co-wrote a paper about opportunity zones. Then we had Cory Booker and we had Tim Scott, sign on. And then, there was some shenanigans on the side, but it became law. And then President Trump became very proud of it.
But honestly, I ended up in the White House during the TICJA legislation. And so every time we had a meeting, I would just, sort of at the end say, oh, what about me? And then I would say, don't forget opportunity zones. I'm not saying I'm
No, I know you delivered.
But it's funny how life works sometimes, right?
But it's a beautiful story of what you can do, even across aisles, get something done in action. It's not kumbaya. It makes a difference. I know there are issues that need to be tweaked. I guess my question to you is, you've just lived through, you look 30 years younger, by the way, for some reason. But I guess my question to you, after everything you've just gone through, as you see the new administration come in, do you think we're going to get back to that kind of pragmatic deal-making, work across the aisle muscle that I thought you and Jared Bernstein brought to this? And I should mention to the audience, Jared Bernstein is now in the White House as an advisor to President Biden. He doesn't know that he's the Kevin Hassett mole.
Well, I can say, first of all, that without naming names or anything, but I've certainly made myself available to the incoming team. And there's all sorts of technical things about top secret clearances and what you can read where, and how the CEA can get into the loop for getting briefings that are important economically and so on. And so definitely I've been working out as collegially as I can to help those folks out. And I'm sure we're going to have policy differences, but the thing that I actually would say jumps out at me the most about the Biden economic team, and I'm not contrasting them with anyone, is that they're just a bunch of really nice folks, really nice people. And so my guess is that once we get through this extremely partisan time, which is probably going to last a little bit, that at least in terms of policy, there will be an opportunity to have serious policy debates with the likes of CeCe Rouse and Janet Yellen and so on.
So, Kevin, I have known you a long time, and I used to know what, you used to be the anchor for me of what I thought Republicans thought about economic policy, fiscally conservative, pro-trade, pro-globalization. Peter Navarro, an economist, I listen to Peter, I'm going, well, that's not on the map that I used to know. I guess what would you call GOP economic mooring today?
The thing is that I'm just an economist, and I try to just say what I think economics says is right. And I'll tell you a little secret, because we got to break news on this Hill event, right? That when I went into the White House just to sort of jack around the people who said about me what you just said, I put a big globe in my office.
Oh no!
But the fact is that there's a lot of stuff that all economists will agree about, and one of them, I'm not all in on the Biden plan, so I think he slightly exaggerated it, but I know a lot of people have been doing that. But for sure, we need a stimulus right now. For sure, there's stuff in the plan that I wouldn't do, like the $15 minimum wage is something you should talk about later. You shouldn't do it now, and so on. But the fact is that if you look at like the percentages of small businesses open, it's actually been heading seriously south. Because first, the virus is more prevalent, but also with the vaccine coming, the rate of return from hiding in your basement for another month is really high for people. And you see it in the social distancing data. Businesses are shutting down again. We're looking at the kind of negative shock we had in the first half of last year. And so absolutely, Janet Yellen is right. The president is right that we need to have a stimulus. I'm not sure it'd be exactly the way they designed it, but it needs to be something pretty big, because we had the biggest negative shock since World War II last year. We're going to have something smaller than that now. But the reason we've kind of survived it through here economically is that we had massive stimulus. And sadly, I think we're going to need a little bit more.
Kevin, is it a mistake to embrace the Buy America stuff so strongly? Joe Biden has put that out as a major executive order. Pete DeFazio was just bracing this. I mean, you and I both know that there are winners and losers in broad global trade, but in the broad trade side, this country, at least traditionally, has benefited enormously. Aggregate incomes, overall have risen. You've got, major technology. I just sort of looked at 9/11 way back 20 years ago as having been this big disruptor in trust, where you moved ideas, people, institutions, and money more frictionlessly around the world. Well, but we have higher and higher fear in this country, and so we have global supply chain problems now. And I'm just wondering if we're running inside our walls too much, and whether there's going to be a real cost to that.
Well, I think that there needs to be kind of a reckoning, and I think that there are sort of three classes of things. One thing is something that there's a big global market for. You can buy it from lots of different countries. They compete for your business. So maybe if they offer it cheaper, then it's really great to have them have a large share of the U.S. market. The second type of thing is something like a Huawei chip, where China would love to dump Huawei chips into our 5G network so they can spy on everybody. It's probably not a great national security idea to do that. And the third category of things is things like antibiotics, which we get a bunch of them from China still, and PPE and all the kind of stuff that we ended up being short of this year because of the pandemic. Probably there are reasons going forward to make sure that we've got either big stockpiles in the U.S. or ample U.S. production, so that if another crisis hits, that we don't run out of stuff. And I think it's really important that Congress and the president sort of begin a conversation about those three categories of things, and maybe think about which goes in what bucket. I would say that it looks to me like the Biden administration is kind of going about it all wrong so far. I'm really worried. They seem almost open to letting Huawei back in, and the Buy America stuff isn't really focused on the things that are urgent for security going forward and so on. And so I think that they can do a better job of it. But I do think even for free traders like me, and I know you kind of, that there's probably some stuff that we ought to be thinking more carefully about having at least stockpiles of.
You know, before we go, I just want to say to our audience, you know, Larry Lindsey, who was National Economic Advisor to President George W. Bush, was a real truth teller. You know, he got in trouble for basically saying, here's what the cost of the Iraq war were going to be. I think he said $200 billion at the time, which sounds staggeringly high.
Right?
He underestimated it, but I mean, he got, you know, that was the issue. But I love that. So as a truth teller yourself, when should we begin worrying about aggregate national debt?
Oh, it's something that is going to start to show up in inflation. Even the numbers today, you see a deflator number came out today that shows that it's heading up. The fact is that the history of, you know, basically issuing a lot of debt and having the central bank buy it is a pretty sorry one for countries around the world. And for me, I think that the end game needs to be something like a big fiscal consolidation, which basically means that what we do is we put everything on the table, long-run spending, long-run entitlements, and so on, and then make it so that people can see, oh, they've really improved the trajectory of everything that the government's doing, so that, you know, down the road, they're going to be issuing a lot less debt. So it's okay to buy some today. I don't have to worry that I'm going to get flooded with future debt. I think if we have a big fiscal consolidation in the next 2 or 3 years, Matt Jensen and I wrote an American Enterprise Institute study about this a long time ago, then we could sort of get out of this relatively unscathed. But if we don't, then what's going to happen is we're going to have inflation. We're going to have inflation like we had in the 70s, and it's starting to inch up now. You know, and the Fed's sort of hoping for a little bit of inflation, I think. But the thing about inflation, the history of it is once it heads up, it gets out of control relatively quickly. And before you know it, you got to hire Paul Volcker again.
So, Kevin, I want to make a little news with you before we close out here. You know, you, of course, wrote Dow 36,000. I always think about that because, you know, we're getting close there finally, so you're finally right. But I think the other question is, you know, I have a Robinhood account, and I, you know, have been watching GameStop and some of these things. If we were sitting in Davos this week, which is going on in World Economic Forum, and Steve Cohen of, you know, Point 72 were there in the audience listening to this, you know, how do you frame this issue of short sellers, large hedge funds, you know, who've engaged in short attacks and hold major short positions? I mean, these are big behaviors they have the wherewithal to do. And then you get a bunch of little guys on Robinhood or on Wall Street Bets and say, we're gonna take these guys on because they're screwing us in the market, and we have a right to do that. I guess my question is, you know, between that little guy challenging, you know, forcing the short attacks off the field with long attacks, how do you feel about that? You know these markets.
Right. No, I fully celebrate the idea that there are all these little guys, you know, swinging for the fences. You know, I worry that some of them are going to lose a lot of money that they didn't expect to lose and get drawn in and you know, make a mistake because they're really kind of gambling. But the fact is that the way an efficient market works is you got like a million voices competing for the truth about where the price should go. And so the more the merrier, the more voices, the wisdom of crowds will drive the market towards more efficiency. And the thing about this episode that really jumps out at me is that when they sort of shut down, all of a sudden changed the rules in the middle of the game and shut down trading, that was kind of a breach of trust between the company and the investors. And I know that every now and then, you know, the exchanges themselves will halt trading for some strange reason, like there's negative news about a company or something. But in this case, just all of a sudden changing the rules in the middle of the game feels like terribly, terribly wrong to me. And so I think the way to think about it is that, you know, crowds can be wise, they could be stupid. But in the end, the more voices you have, you know, basically every trade is somebody who thinks something's going down, so they sell it, to somebody who thinks it's going up. And so having diversity of opinion is good. The more opinions I have, the better the market functions.
And there we had some major news from Kevin Hassett on GameStop, Robinhood, you know, the hedge fund guys. I really, really appreciate your candor, Kevin, and your big ideas. I mean, today I really wanted to do this to say, what are the big ideas that we can do there? I want to credit you and, of course, Jared Bernstein with, you know, opportunity zones, which I think will continue to have an important part in the economic equation for disadvantaged communities and others. So thank you for that. So Kevin Hassett, former chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, vice president, managing director of the Lindsey Group. Great to see you, my friend. I hope you'll come back many more times.
Of course, yeah. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Kevin. My final guest for this hour is someone I've already mentioned, Mayor of Miami, Francis Suarez. I'm looking forward to hearing his expectations from the Biden administration and what he's going to be doing in his role as an incoming honcho in the Conference of Mayors. Francis, let's see, do we have you there? There we go.
I'm here.
Good to see you again, my friend. I don't know
you.
if you heard Anthony Fox on earlier. I had Anthony Fox, former Secretary of Transportation. He's now the head of policy at Lyft, and I said, look, I've got Francis Suarez coming on Miami. How's Miami treating you? And he says, we could do better with micro mobility down there. But we were talking a little bit about you. But look, I mean, I have a lot of respect for what you've done through this COVID crisis, what you've done for elders in your community, what you're doing with sort of intergenerational issues and, smart infrastructure. I want to give you an opportunity because I really love what you've been doing. And I guess I can say that because I'm an opinion guy. But as you look at your map, both in Miami and as you try and do show and tell for other mayors around the nation on best and promising practices, what's at the top of your list?
There's so many things that are at the top of the list. First of all, the fundamentals, right? We want to make sure that our taxes are as low as possible. We want to make sure that the most amount of money is in our residents' hands. So we've reduced taxes to the second lowest rate in the last 60 years. We see other cities going in the opposite direction, and that is, frankly, creating a migration towards Miami. And the second thing that we want to do is we want to make Miami the sort of the safest big city in America. And so we've invested a tremendous amount in making sure that we have the most technology in terms of policing, the most number of officers. We've increased our budgets while other cities have decreased their budgets. And we've seen, return on our investment. We've reduced crime by 25% last year. The year before that, we had the lowest homicide rate since 1954. So when you combine a city that has, this is not a virtual background, by the way, that has, weather like we have, a tax structure like we have, is incredibly safe, it becomes a worldwide attraction. And we're seeing massive migrations now from New York, from the hedge funds and private equity. And we're also seeing massive migrations from Silicon Valley, from angel investors and from VCs. And that's happening more and more every day.
Well, look, 5-10 years ago, that wasn't the case. I mean, you had, side offices there, but Miami was looked at as a pass-through spot, as a tourism spot. Are you saying that you're going to become more of a headquarters spot, more of a primary anchor and corner in the business world?
Yes, that's exactly what's happening. I mean, you have these major companies like Blackstone taking a big position a couple of weeks ago. Marcelo Claude from SoftBank yesterday announced a $100 million Miami-specific fund, venture capital fund. You have founders like Keith Rabois, Peter Thiel that just bought a house here and are sort of doubling down on Miami. We're talking to Elon Musk. I'm going to be talking to Elon Musk in the next few days about tunnel boring, similar to what they're doing in Las Vegas, to help us with traffic and congestion, which is another issue that is not just a Miami issue, it's an urban issue across America. And then we're trying to be very thoughtful about some of the issues that you talked about, aging, about income inequality, which I think is the challenge of my generation. And I think we're doing that by promoting technologies that have a social focus and can monetize it in a way that creates upward mobility. So those are the things that we are trying to accomplish here in the city.
Tell us a little bit about what you're doing with the elder community, with the 50 plus, 65 plus community, because I thought it was rather, when we last spoke, it was rather revolutionary that you had such dedicated funds and plans to that community. It's not often you hear that.
Yeah, what happens is they're usually forgotten, unfortunately, and most of them live on fixed income. So what's happening is, there's presumption that if they're in an affordable housing unit, that they're okay. And what people don't realize and weren't realizing until we did the analysis was that the cost of living continues to go up. Their Social Security payments are not going up at the same rate at the cost of living, and their rent payments are also going up. So we created an elderly rental assistance program to make up for the gap between their increase in rental payments and the fact that their Social Security payments were not increasing by the same margin. And that's something that, for the elderly, that means that they can pay for cable. That means that they can go out and buy groceries. That means that they can put gas in their car. I mean, these are the kinds of decisions that they have to make. It's so unfortunate that, so many in our community that have done so much for my generation and for my parents' generation have to live and make choices like that, which, by the way, for most people, it's a $25 choice or a $50 choice in a given month. That's how tight their margins are and how closely they're living into poverty.
Francis, what are we doing with schools in Miami? And I hate to be negative, but when you kind of go through and look at the impact on kids, particularly K through 8, K through 9 students, where so many of the issues about what they learn is one element, but the socialization is another. People worry that it's been a lot of time. You're going to have a wobbliness in performance that is not their fault. In this, do you have any thoughts on? Because I know you think a lot about education. That's where I first met you ages ago. How do we get that education reset in a way that's going to maybe hopefully address some of these uneven outcomes of this last year?
I think there's three specific things that we have to do. The first is we have to find a way to give every child in our city, in every city, the digital tools that they need to be successful. I mean, my kids are going to grow up, with an iPhone. They're going to grow up with an iPad. They're going to get the ability to use these digital tools. And we have to make sure that all children have that ability. The second thing is we need to make sure that they have broadband connection. I'm working with a couple of organizations to hopefully, unveil an initiative that will allow for broadband in underprivileged areas of the city. We just announced yesterday Wi-Fi in all of our parks. And that's a huge initiative that creates a broadband connectivity. But the third piece, Steve, is a piece I think you're talking about the most, which is making sure that our curriculum in our public schools, charter schools, and even in our private schools is up to snuff. And I think we have to understand that we are living in a technological world, whether we like it or not, whether we like technology, regardless of what side of the political spectrum you are on, and regardless of how you feel about technology, it's here to stay. I mean, it invades every single thing we do, even in this interview that we're doing right now. So, we need to prepare our children for that tomorrow. And I think to do that, we have to make sure that they're learning coding and programming as a second language, and they need to be doing that in pre-elementary school age. So that's another initiative that I'm working on with the school board to hopefully have that rolled out.
You got a lot of initiatives on your plate. One other quick initiative I want to hear about. So tell us about Lab Miami.
Lab Miami is one of our big incubators. It's one of the first organizations that created an incubation space for entrepreneurs and for people in the tech space. We've been growing this ecosystem in Miami for the last 10 years. We just got this incredible lightning in a bottle J-curve moment when I tweeted out, "How can I help?" to a tweet from Deli and from Founders Fund that said, what if we were to bring Silicon Valley to Miami? And just the mere fact that I said, "How can I help?" was so earth-shattering because it was so in opposition to the way tech founders are being treated in other cities across America. And that's given us a tremendous opportunity to have these new companies and these new founders that are coming here reinvest in our community. So we're working with a variety of different companies, Blackstone being one of them, to make sure that they're able to make strategic investments to help organizations like Lab Miami continue to provide scale-up opportunities and mentoring opportunities for young entrepreneurs that want to build revolutionary companies.
If you were to ask for one thing from Joe Biden when you eventually see him, what is it going to be?
What we've talked about prior to him taking office is that he would listen to our, and to particularly my vision when it comes to climate policy. I was the chair of the Environment Committee. I'm on a global council on adaptation. And frankly, he was extremely open to that. He said that he wanted to listen to what I had to say on climate. And so for us, I would ask him for a robust infrastructure climate investment plan. We've been talking about it for years. We've been talking about infrastructure for so many years and haven't gotten it. And I think this country deserves it. We pay a lot. Everybody pays a lot in taxes. And frankly, we have a $200 million resiliency bond in the city of Miami. But for it to maximize its effectiveness, we have to leverage it with larger governments. The state has a $90 billion budget. We have $1 billion budget. So it's a 90-to-1 ratio. The federal government has a multi-trillion dollar budget. So we need our partners to step up and protect us and our vulnerable infrastructure so that we can deliver on our promise of making sure that Miami is here forever, which is our brand.
So Miami Mayor Francis Suarez, I'm really irritated with your backdrop. I'm trying to get over it. It is freezing here in Washington. It's even worse in New York and up north. But what I'm attracted to is the power of your ideas, your excellent thinking about policy and how to get some of this stuff right. I look forward to welcoming you back in Washington when you do a lot of your work on the Conference of Mayors this next year. And so thank you so much for sharing your time with us today.
Always here for you, buddy.
Thank you so much. That brings us to the end of the first band of our Reset Summit. A big thank you to all of you attendees for joining us for this discussion. I hope you go run around the block now. I'm going to. If you missed any of these conversations, we're going to have the video of this event, all of the event up shortly. We'll be back at 2:30 p.m. Eastern for Band 2, where we will tackle immigration and the environment. I don't know if we're going to tackle them, but we're going to explore them. We're going to be joined by Congressman Ted Deutsch, co-founder of the Climate Solutions Caucus, Janet Murguia of Unidos US, and many others. I'm Steve Clemens. Be well.